Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission, as always, is simple. We take a pile of sources, history, psychology, strategy, and, well, we boil it all down. We extract the absolute essentials so you can really master the topic. Today, we are diving deep into a name that just screams ambition, maybe ruthlessness, cold calculation, political games. Machiavelli. You hear Machiavellian, right? And instantly you picture some cynical CEO, a backstabbing politician. It almost always traces back to that one infamous book, The Prince. But here's the thing, the kind of mustache-twirling villain image, it's a massive oversimplification. It hides this brilliant, honestly complex thinker who is dealing with, well, total chaos. We really want to dig into why the guy who wrote about creating law and order became the poster child for breaking every rule in the book. So our deep dive today, it's designed to get past that stereotype. We're looking at Machiavellianism through three specific lenses, drawing from all our source material. First, there's the actual historical figure, Niccolò Machiavelli, and his, let's say, radical ideas about leadership ethics, consequentialism. Second, we'll look at the modern psychological trait, the clinical definition of a high Mach personality. And third, how do these principles actually get used today? The practical side. In business and leadership, we want that deep, nuanced picture connecting all three.
And that connection, it's packed with irony, which is exactly why this deep dive is so needed. The starting point, obviously, Niccolò Machiavelli, Italian Renaissance diplomat. He wrote The Prince after his career kind of imploded. It was published after his death, 1532. And the sources make it clear right away, his name got tied to all these shady political tactics. But the concept itself, it's evolved. It's now something modern psychology actually measures.
But measures how? Like a test.
Yeah, exactly. Psychologists developed what's called the Mach 4 test. It gauges manipulativeness, self-interest, that kind of thing. It's a scale out of 100. And generally, if you score over 60, you're considered high Mach.
Yeah.
But like you said, there's this huge gap, isn't there, between that clinical profile of the self-serving manipulator and what Machiavelli seems to have intended, writing about how to build a functioning government.
A massive gap.
Yeah. So to bridge it, we absolutely have to start with the world he lived in, the history.
Okay, let's unpack that history. Because when we think Renaissance Italy, 16th century, it sounds glorious, right? Art, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, rebirth. But for Italy politically, our sources paint a very different picture. Fragmented, chaotic, corrupt.
That's exactly right. Italy wasn't one country then. It was just this patchwork of small city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, always fighting each other. And crucially, they were constantly getting pushed around, invaded even, by the big powers like France and Spain. So Machiavelli wasn't just sitting around philosophizing in an ivory tower. He was writing a practical survival guide. How do you create any kind of stability in that environment? His big question was fundamental. How do you even establish a government, create laws, maintain order when you're surrounded by political anarchy and constant threats?
And the sources really stress the personal context for the prince. It wasn't just academic. It feels almost bitter. Maybe vengeful. He wrote it in 1513, just after the Medici family came back into power in Florence. Machiavelli had worked for the previous government, the Republic. So when the Medicis returned, he was out. Arrested, actually. Tortured, then banished.
That's right. He was literally stuck on his farm outside Florence when he penned this. The Latin title was De Principatibus, which means of principalities. And there's this fascinating tension the sources point out. He actually dedicated the book to Lorenzo de' Medici, maybe hoping to get back in favor, get a job.
Seems plausible.
But then other scholars suggest something else. He chose to write it in everyday Italian, the vernacular, not scholarly Latin. Why? Maybe it was a strategic move, a way to kind of expose the inner workings of power, the ruler's schemes, to a wider audience who could actually read Italian. A demonstration of his insight, maybe, but also a potential warning.
And writing it was, in itself, a radical move, wasn't it? It broke from how political philosophy had been done for centuries.
Completely. Think about the philosophers before him. They were focused on ideals, virtues, Plato, Aristotle, how a prince should act to be morally good. Machiavelli, he basically threw that playbook out.
Why? What was his alternative?
He was interested in what works, in what happens, in fact, not in some imagined utopia. This is the absolute core of his approach. He called it following the effectual truth. Verità effettuale.
Verità effettuale. Effectual truth. That sounds simple, but feels loaded. What did he mean by distinguishing that from the imagination of it?
He meant stripping away the idealism, focusing on pure practicality. His argument was, look, if a ruler always tries to be perfectly good and moral, they're going to get crushed because most people around them are not perfectly good and moral, especially in politics. So to keep the state stable, To survive, the ruler has to learn how to be not good non buono when necessity forces their hand. And he really hammers that word, necessity.
Necessity.
It's like he invented political science by yanking it away from moral theology. He said, let's look at what is, not what we wish ought to be.
Which leads us straight into the really thorny part, his ethics, his leadership ethics. If he wasn't just saying be evil, as the stereotype suggests, then what was his moral framework?
It's purely consequentialist. That's the key term. What matters isn't whether an action is inherently good or bad in isolation. What matters is the outcome for the state.
So the ends justify the means. Is it that simple?
It's often put that way, but it's a bit more specific. He's not saying evil is good. He's saying sometimes you face a choice where action A is morally ugly, maybe even cruel, but it leads to a better long-term outcome stability, order. And action B looks morally clean, maybe it's doing nothing, but it leads to chaos, suffering, destruction. In that situation, the consequentialist argues, you must choose A.
So the ethical calculation is always driven by necessity and the ultimate result for the collective, for the state.
Precisely. And the choice has to be forced by circumstances. The constraint has to be real. The action is only justified if it's genuinely the least bad option available. Often, he implies, the choice isn't between good and evil at all. It's between two different kinds of evil, a lesser evil and a greater evil. And that framework, that harsh calculus, is the only place where his most notorious idea could even come from. The concept of cruelty well used.
Right. That phrase alone is probably responsible for half his bad reputation. How did he possibly justify cruelty? How could it be well used versus, well, just badly used?
He was incredibly specific about this. It wasn't a blank check for brutality. Cruelty could only be ethically defensible under extreme historical conditions.
Yes.
What conditions? One, it had to be swift and decisive. Get it over with. Two, it had to be used sparingly, not constantly. And three, the only justification was if it successfully maintained authority, ensured security, and ultimately benefited the state and its people by ending chaos or preventing worse violence.
So cruelty that's prolonged, random, or just for personal gain or spite, that's out.
Absolutely out. He guarantees that kind of cruelty breeds hatred, and hatred will destroy the ruler. Guaranteed.
He gave an example, didn't he, to illustrate this really fine, dangerous line.
Yes, a very famous one. Cesare Borgia, a figure known even then for being utterly ruthless. Borgia took over the Romagna region, which was apparently pure anarchy. He used very harsh, calculated cruelty to impose order, swiftly. And the result, Machiavelli points out, the result was unification, peace, and eventually the people became loyal because they had stability. So Machiavelli poses this incredibly provocative question. Was Borgia, through his decisive cruelty, actually more merciful in the long run than the Florentines?
How could he be more merciful?
Because Florence, Machiavelli's own city, prided itself on its civility, its supposed mercy. But through their indecisiveness, their reluctance to use necessary force, they allowed another city, Pistoia, to basically tear itself apart through internal conflict. So Florentine mercy led to prolonged suffering and destruction. Borgia's calculated cruelty led to lasting peace. Which outcome was truly better for the people?
Wow, that's a stark comparison. It really forces you to weigh the immediate act against the final consequence. The lesser of two evils, starkly put.
It's a cold calculus, no doubt. But it highlights his core point. In leadership, especially in crisis, you judge actions by their results for the state, not by abstract virtue. Inaction, or morally pure inaction, can sometimes be the most destructive path.
And you know, this principle, even though it's from the 16th century, it still echoes today, doesn't it? When leaders face these terrible choices involving potential loss of life to maybe prevent even greater loss.
It absolutely does. Our sources actually brought up a really heavy modern parallel. President Truman's decision to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, that's probably the ultimate example of lesser evil reasoning on a horrifying scale.
It really pushes consequentialist ethics to the absolute limit. Using those weapons was an act of immense immediate cruelty, hundreds of thousands killed instantly, unimaginable. Yet the justification offered then, and often debated since, was precisely Machiavellian in its logic. Truman and his advisors argued it was necessary to prevent an even greater catastrophe.
The planned invasion of Japan.
Exactly. Military estimates at the time predicted that a full ground invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost potentially hundreds of thousands of American lives, and maybe millions of Japanese lives, given the expected resistance, the mobilization of civilians.
So the argument becomes, This horrific, instantaneous cruelty of the bomb was the necessary, least bad way to force a swift surrender and avoid that prolonged, even bloodier alternative of invasion.
That's the core of the justification. It forces a leader into this impossible choice. Massive, immediate death from the air or drawn-out massive death on the ground. Machiavelli would likely frame it as which path ultimately secures the state's survival and stability with the least overall long-term damage. It's an agonizing decision, but it fits that harsh framework of choosing the lesser evil when necessity dictates.
It really underscores the difference he saw between private morality, personal feelings of right and wrong, and the unique, heavy responsibility of a leader whose primary job is the survival of the state itself.
The morality shifts. It has to, in his view, when the stakes are that high.
Yeah. Okay, let's move from the ethics of extreme measures to the more day-to-day management of power. Probably his most famous piece of advice. Is it better for a leader to be loved or feared?
Yes. His answer is crystal clear. Ideally, you want both, love and fear. But he says those two are hard to combine. So if you had to choose just one, it is much safer. Sicuro is the Italian word. Safer to be feared than loved.
Safer? Why is love so unreliable in his eyes? What's wrong with being loved?
Well, it comes down to his pretty dim view of human nature. He famously wrote that men are, I'm quoting here, ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous.
Ouch.
Yeah. So love, according to Machiavelli, is held together by a bond of obligation. But because men are inherently self-interested, base, he calls them, they'll break that bond of love the minute it becomes inconvenient or offers them some personal advantage.
So loyalty based on affection just evaporates when things get tough.
Pretty much. Fear, on the other hand, fear is maintained by the dread of punishment which never fails. Fear keeps people in line, ensures obedience, guarantees security for the ruler, especially when times are hard. Love is flimsy, fear is reliable.
But, and this is critical, right? He put a very important limit on that fear. It wasn't just be terrified.
Absolute crucial limit.
Yeah.
The prince must ensure that he is feared, yes, but not feared to the point of hatred. Hatred is political suicide. It's the poison pill.
And how does a ruler avoid crossing that line from fear into hatred? What are the specific triggers for hatred?
He names two things explicitly, two absolute red lines. If a ruler crosses these, hatred is guaranteed. Number one, do not interfere with your subjects' property. Their land, their money, don't take it arbitrarily. Number two, do not interfere with their women, their families. Respect the private sphere. Machiavelli believed, perhaps cynically, that men will eventually forget the death of their father more easily than the loss of their inheritance. If you respect property and family, people will tolerate the necessary harshness used to maintain order. Violate those, you create deep, personal, universal hatred, and you're doomed.
Okay, so fear, yes, but contained fear, not hatred. Now, in terms of actually holding on to power, Machiavelli saw two basic sources, right? Can we define those?
Sure. And these are concepts still very relevant in leadership studies today. First, you have coercive power. That's power based on force, threats, punishment, the ability to compel people. That's the lion side of things. Second, there's referent power. This is power that comes from people's loyalty, admiration, respect, goodwill towards the leader. It's influence, legitimacy, winning hearts and minds, essentially. Machiavelli absolutely advocates trying to build that referent power whenever you can.
And one of his most surprising pieces of advice on how to build that referent power, especially surprising given the tyrant stereotype, involves weapons, arming the citizens.
It seems totally counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why would a ruler, especially a new one worried about stability, give weapons to the populace? But his advice is direct and unambiguous. New princes should arm their subjects. He saw it as a crucial step.
Why? What was the logic?
His logic was about trust and loyalty. Arming your people transforms them from potentially distrusted subjects into active, loyal partisans of your rule. It shows you trust them. Conversely, if you disarm them, that immediately signals distrust. It makes the ruler look weak, suspicious, maybe even cowardly. An armed populace, if governed reasonably, becomes a source of strength, not a threat.
And the sources connect this idea of the ruler being connected to an armed citizenry to more modern leadership ideas too, like the prince needing to train, hunt, know the land.
Yes, the idea was the prince shouldn't be remote. He needed to be physically hardened, familiar with the terrain, capable of leading his citizen army in battle. He had to be competent and present. The modern parallel drawn is management by wandering around, or MBWA. The leader needs to be visible, out there, observing, listening to people on the ground level.
Getting out of the office.
Exactly. It also echoes ideas of servant leadership. You're not just issuing orders from on high, you're demonstrating competence, showing you understand the realities your people face, building that connection. You build that relationship in peacetime, so they'll actually fight for you, willingly, in wartime.
Okay, one last key piece of his advice on leadership style before we move on. The dual nature, being both clever and strong. He said a prince needs to understand both law, the way of humans, and force, the way of beasts.
Right, this leads to his famous analogy of the fox and the lion. He says a ruler can't just be the lion. Relying only on brute force, the lion, is foolish. Why? Because the lion can't see traps. It can't defend itself against snares, political intrigue, deception. So the prince must also study the fox. Be clever like the fox to recognize traps, sniff out deception, understand hidden motives. But you can't only be the fox either, because the fox is weak. You also need the lion to frighten away the wolves, the powerful enemies, the disloyal factions. You need that strength, that force. A truly effective, durable ruler has to master both natures.
And mastering the fox, the cleverness, that required a certain performance, didn't it? He famously said the prince must be a great pretender and dissembler, an actor almost.
Yes, appearance was paramount. He listed 5 key qualities the prince must appear to have at all times: merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright.
Appear to have, not actually be.
The emphasis is entirely on the appearance. Machiavelli was deeply aware that in politics, perception often is reality. He advises that while the prince must be ready, absolutely ready, to act contrary to these virtues when necessity dictates, when the survival of the state is on the line, he must always maintain the outward show of possessing them.
Why? What's the justification for that level of public deception?
It's cold, but pragmatic. His line was, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand," meaning everybody sees what you seem to be. Very few get close enough to know what you really are. And in the volatile world of politics, the judgment of the masses, who only see the surface, carries more weight for stability than the judgment of the insiders who might know the necessary evils committed behind the scenes. It's about managing public opinion for the sake of order.
Okay, so we have this picture now of the historical Machiavelli, writing a survival guide for rulers in a brutal, lawless time, focusing on outcomes, necessity, the effectual truth, advising calculated fear, arming citizens, being both fox and lion, and managing appearances. It was all aimed ultimately at creating stability, maybe even restoring law and order, which makes it the perfect point to ask, how on earth did his name get completely twisted to mean the exact opposite? The cynical, self-serving manipulator.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it leads us straight into the modern psychological concept. Essentially, the world grabbed onto the methods he described, the potential for ruthlessness, the deception, the focus on appearances, and completely divorced them from the goal he stated: preserving the state, establishing order. They took the tools out of context.
All right, let's shift gears then. Let's talk about the Machiavellianism most people probably think of today, the one from psychology. It's defined as a specific personality trait, right? With a whole set of, well, pretty negative characteristics.
Yes, absolutely. In psychology, Machiavellianism is one part of the dark triad. It's a cluster of 3 personality traits, generally seen as socially undesirable:
And the other 2 are?
narcissism and psychopathy. Machiavellianism sits alongside them. The high Mac individual, as they're called, is characterized by a few core things: deep-seated manipulativeness, a tendency towards deceit, very high levels of self-interest, and maybe the most defining feature, viewing other people primarily as tools, as means to an end, to achieve their own goals.
How does that high Mac profile really differ from a narcissist or a psychopath? They all sound pretty bad. Are there key distinctions?
There are, mainly in their style and maybe their core drivers. Narcissists, for example, crave admiration. They need external validation. They have that grandiosity. Psychopaths tend to be much more impulsive, antisocial, often showing a real lack of remorse, sometimes linked to aggression or criminality. The high Mac is typically more strategic, more calculating, less impulsive than the psychopath. They maintain this cool, cynical, quite unemotional view of the world. Empathy is generally very low or absent. Their main motivation is instrumental. They're focused on gaining things: power, status, money, fame. And they're perfectly willing to lie, manipulate, exploit, flatter, whatever it takes to achieve those specific, often long-term personal goals.
It sounds like they share that focus on the outcome with the historical Machiavelli, but the outcome is entirely selfish. Personal gain, not state stability.
Exactly. It's Machiavelli's pragmatism stripped of any larger purpose beyond the self. And this impacts their relationships profoundly. The sources note that high Macs usually avoid deep, close interpersonal attachments. It's not necessarily that they can't form them, but their fundamental worldview gets in the way.
How so?
They tend to see everyone through this negative, distrustful lens. They assume others are also trying to manipulate them or are out for themselves. So genuine trust, vulnerability, the things needed for real emotional connection, they're rare and maybe even seen as weaknesses to be exploited rather than sources of fulfillment.
Okay, so if they're strategic, calculating, maybe good actors like the historical prince, how do you actually spot a high Mac? Especially in, say, a work environment. They might not be obviously disruptive like a raging narcissist.
That's the challenge. They're often harder to spot because they can be masters of impression management, just like the historical advice suggested. You have to look for patterns, behavioral clues that point towards that instrumental, goal-oriented approach.
Like what kind of clues?
Well, things like a noticeable tendency to tell white lies or bend the truth whenever it offers even a small advantage. Exaggerating achievements. Also, a very strategic approach to networking. They often focus intensely on cultivating relationships with people of high status or power, while maybe ignoring or even stepping on peers or subordinates who don't seem useful to them. And perhaps the biggest giveaway is that deep, pervasive cynicism. They often openly express the belief that everyone is fundamentally self-serving, that everyone would lie, cheat, or steal if they thought they could get away with it. It's like they project their own mindset onto the world to justify their behavior.
Let's put this in the office setting. Imagine a team. There's some kind of stress, maybe perceived unfairness. Say, one colleague seems to be the boss's favorite, getting opportunities. How does the high Mac person on that team react compared to others?
This is where their calculative nature really shows, according to the research. Unlike someone who might get openly angry, jealous, or frustrated, the high Mac facing that kind of situation tends to stay remarkably calm, strategic, focused,
So I'm what?
getting even. Not necessarily directly getting even, but focused on how to turn the situation to their own advantage. They actively manage those negative feelings, the envy, the resentment, maybe contempt for the favored colleague. They suppress them. And then strategically, they might actually display positive behaviors towards that very colleague they likely resent. Things like public praise, ingratiation, offering help.
Wow, so they cozy up to the enemy. Why?
Because they see that person not just as a rival, but as a potential tool. An enhancer, as one source put it. By getting closer to the favored colleague, they might gain indirect access to the boss, or learn valuable information, or position themselves better for future opportunities. Their Machiavellian tactics aren't just about manipulation. They're about strategically managing their own emotions and social position to maximize personal gain, even in seemingly negative situations. It's a long game.
That sounds incredibly calculating and exhausting.
Oof.
What's the contrast? How does someone who scores low on Machiavellianism handle that same situation? The boss's favorite, the unfairness.
The contrast is stark, and it's mostly about emotional regulation. The low Mach individual struggles to hide how they feel. They lack that cold, strategic detachment. So, when faced with that same unfairness or stress, they're much more likely to, as the saying goes, fly off the handle. They might complain openly, show visible frustration or anger, become demotivated, maybe withdraw. They can't easily compartmentalize their feelings and act strategically against them. They react emotionally, often to their own detriment in a political environment.
Okay, so we have the high Mac. Calculating, strategic, uses people, cynical. And the low Mach, more emotionally transparent, less strategic in navigating office politics. Which brings us right back to that massive irony we mentioned at the start. Based on everything we've learned about the historical Machiavelli, his aims, his context, our sources suggest he himself probably wouldn't score very high in the test named after him. He might even score low.
It is deeply ironic, isn't it? When you look at the actual items on the Mach 4 scale, they often tap into pure cynicism and self-interest. Statements like, "It is safest to assume that all people have a vicious streak and that it will come out when they are given a chance." Or, "Anyone who completely trusts anyone else is asking for trouble."
Which sounds a bit like things Machiavelli observed about human nature. No.
He certainly observed those tendencies, yes. He agreed with the premise that humans can be fickle, self-interested, untrustworthy. The crucial difference is the purpose behind acknowledging that reality. The modern high Mach uses that cynical view to justify exploiting others for personal gain status, money, power, pure self-interest, the historical Machiavelli. His acknowledgement of human flaws was the starting point for figuring out how to build a system, a stable state, with laws that could contain those flaws and channel them, ultimately for the collective good. His goal, arguably, was to create an order where people could eventually get ahead by living morally because the state itself was secure and functional.
So the high Mac uses manipulation to break or bend rules for personal profit. The historical Machiavelli advised using manipulation reluctantly and temporarily, only as a tool to establish and solidify a system of rules for the benefit of everyone in the state.
Exactly. That's the fundamental split. The historical Machiavelli, particularly in his other writings like the Discourses on Livy, comes across as a passionate Republican. He valued civic virtue, good laws, a strong citizenry. His analysis of power in The Prince was a brutal, realistic look at how power actually worked in his chaotic times, but the intention seems to have been achieving a functional, ordered society. The psychological trait that bears his name. It captures only the ruthless means he sometimes advised for extreme situations and completely strips away the Republican, law-focused end he seems to have valued most.
That distinction is absolutely vital. The difference between the historical statesman trying to build order and the modern psychological profile of the manipulator. It's the perfect frame for this last section. Let's talk about how we can take Machiavelli's strategic principles, maybe separating them from the extreme political necessity he faced, and applying them within today's generally lawful society, and distill actual useful lessons for business leaders, for managers, for anyone in an organization.
Right. We can probably group these applications into a few key areas based on the sources. Maybe think about internal leadership style first, then external strategy and adaptation, and finally managing your immediate team, your inner circle. #tag 3.1, Lessons in Leadership Style and Power.
Okay, internal leadership style. What's the first big takeaway from Machiavelli for a modern leader? It seems decisiveness is key, flowing from that lesser evil idea.
Absolutely. When you're faced with tough choices, maybe it's a painful restructuring, a necessary layoff, pivoting the company's strategy paralysis is fatal. Machiavelli was adamant that indecision itself is a destructive force. Leaders have to, well, take the bull by the horns, be clear, be decisive. Even if both options stink, you have to choose one that seems less bad for the organization's future and move forward. Indecision just lets problems fester.
And didn't the sources mention something interesting about decisiveness in business today? A gender difference.
Yes, one source highlighted research suggesting that, on average, women in business leadership roles tend to demonstrate more decisiveness than their male counterparts. Which is interesting because it shows this isn't just about some 16th century strongman ideal. It's a fundamental leadership competency about timely judgment under pressure, regardless of style.
Okay, decisiveness first. What's the second principle for internal style? It relates to focus, right? Focus on the core goal. Machiavelli said a prince's only thought should be war and its organization.
Right. Obviously, for a modern CEO, war isn't literal combat. It's the company's core strategic objective. Its mission. Its survival and growth in the market. The principle is, the leader's primary focus must remain relentlessly on that high-level strategy. And this provides a really strong Machiavellian argument against micromanagement.
How so?
Because micromanaging pulls the leader down into the weeds. It distracts them from their essential war, the big picture, the strategic direction. It also, as plenty of research shows, frustrates and demotivates the team you're supposed to be trusting, Machiavelli would say. Focus on the main objective. Trust your commanders, your managers, to handle the tactical details. If you're bogged down in stuff you should delegate, you've lost sight of the real battle.
Makes sense. Decisiveness, focus. What's the third internal lesson? Something about motivation.
Yes, this one feels almost counterintuitive coming from Machiavelli, but it's about the driving force behind any venture. Let passion be the foundation. He had this great line, where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great.
Meaning, if you really care, you can overcome obstacles.
Essentially, yes. If you're building something, a company, a project, it should ideally stem from something you genuinely care about, something you're passionate about. Because that underlying passion, that willingness, is what fuels the perseverance needed to get through the inevitable tough times he knew so well. The sources gave a contemporary example, looking at the incredible economic growth in the UAE. Part of that success story is often attributed to creating an environment that really fosters and supports passionate entrepreneurs. When people are building something they love, the work becomes meaningful, fruitful, and that energy drives success, not just for them, but for the whole economy.
That's a powerful point. Passion fuels resilience. Okay, and the last quote on internal style. Something about learning.
Learning from the greats. Machiavelli was very clear. A wise leader doesn't try to reinvent every wheel. They should follow the paths beaten by great men and imitate those who have excelled before them.
So study history, study successful predecessors.
Exactly. It's not weakness, it's strategic strength. In modern terms, this translates directly to things like mentorship, studying case studies, learning from best practices. But there's a crucial Machiavellian caveat here from the sources. You have to choose the right models to imitate. Find mentors or examples that align not just with your industry or business style, but crucially with your ethical framework.
So don't just copy a successful leader if their methods were ethically dubious.
Precisely. Learning strategy from someone who embodies that cynical, high-mac approach might bring short-term wins, but it could easily destroy your reputation, your team's trust, and maybe even land you in legal trouble in the long run. Choose your heroes wisely. Hashtag 3.2, strategic adaptation and influence.
Okay, that covers the internal leadership style. Let's shift focus outwards now. How did Machiavelli advise leaders to deal with the wider world? The external environment, competitors, allies? The first principle seems to be about timing, capturing the zeitgeist.
Yes, understanding the spirit of the times. He argued that success often comes to those who adapt their actions to match the prevailing conditions. Fortune, he said, favors the bold, but also the adaptable. For a modern business, this means staying acutely aware of market trends, which sectors are booming, which are declining. You need your finger constantly on the pulse.
So you can ride the waves instead of fighting the tide.
Exactly. One source used the example of retail growth forecasts, say, in a specific region like the UAE. Knowing that growth is expected allows a smart leader to adjust inventory, marketing strategy to capitalize on that trend. Ignoring the zeitgeist, sticking to old ways when the world has changed, is a recipe for failure in his view.
This connects pretty directly to the next point, doesn't it? Networking and alliances. Alliances were life or death in his time. How does that translate now?
It translates into the power of connections. Business, fundamentally, is about relationships. Machiavelli's core advice here was stark. Avoid the hatred of the most powerful. You absolutely need to cultivate good relationships with key players, major clients, regulators, industry leaders, maybe even powerful competitors sometimes. Their animosity can cripple you.
And in today's world, the tools for this are everywhere.
Absolutely. Social media, especially professional platforms like LinkedIn, have globalized networking. It's no longer just about local connections. The data backs this up too. One source cited that something like 80% of LinkedIn members see networking as critical to their career success. It's ancient wisdom amplified by modern technology. Build your alliances.
Okay, zeitgeist networking. What about threats? When danger appears on the horizon, his advice was pretty blunt here. Deal with threats swiftly.
Yes, he really admired the Romans for this. He said they were brilliant at foreseeing trouble before it fully materialized and dealing with it proactively, even if it meant starting a war early to prevent a bigger, more dangerous war later. His warning was stark. War is not avoided. It is only put off to the advantage of others. If you ignore a threat, it doesn't go away. It just gets stronger while you get weaker.
So in business terms, don't procrastinate on problems.
Exactly. When a crisis hits a market downturn, a major competitor move, a serious internal issue, you have to act immediately. The sources suggest a process. Assemble the right team, do a quick but thorough diagnosis, inward inquiry, and then start experimenting with solutions right away. Build that barrier before the threat overwhelms you.
And related to handling threats and conflict, what about neutrality? If two big players are fighting, should you stay out of it? Machiavelli had strong views here. Avoid neutrality in conflict.
Generally, yes. He saw neutrality as a weak and dangerous position most of the time. His logic was cutting. If you stay neutral between two fighting powers, the winner will likely despise you for not helping them, and the loser will resent you for not supporting them. You end up isolated and vulnerable.
So pick a side.
Unless neutrality is absolutely unavoidable for survival, yes, declare yourself. Support one side. He argued that taking a stance, even if risky, earns you respect from your allies and makes your opponents take you seriously. His line was that irresolute leaders who try to avoid present danger by staying neutral usually end up ruined. In business, this might mean choosing a strategic partner, aligning with an industry standard, or taking a clear stance on a market disruption. Sitting on the fence rarely works long-term. You have to commit. Hashtag 3.3, managing the inner circle.
All right, so we've covered internal style and external strategy. What about the people closest to the leader, the immediate team, the key advisors? Machiavelli had a lot to say about managing this inner circle, starting with how to handle feedback, especially criticism. His advice: encourage criticism and frankness.
Yes, this seems almost modern, doesn't it? He explicitly warned against flatterers. He said the only way to guard against them is to make it absolutely clear to people that telling you the truth, even if it's unpleasant, will not offend you. You have to create psychological safety for honesty.
Because if they fear your reaction, you'll only hear good news until it's too late.
Precisely. And the sources added a crucial modern layer to this.
Mm.
It's not just about asking for feedback. It's about what you do with it. Research shows that managers who actively solicit upward feedback criticism from their team and then actually discuss it with them, show they've heard it, and demonstrate they're trying to act on it, those are the managers who improve. Just asking and ignoring it. That breeds cynicism faster than anything.
So encourage truth-telling and act on it. What's the flip side? The danger he warned about wasn't just flatterers, but also beware of yes men, people just looking out for themselves.
Exactly. He warned leaders to be very wary of advisors or key employees, servants, he called them, who clearly seem more focused on their own profit or advancement than on the leader's or the organization's goals. If someone is constantly agreeing with you, telling you you're right, you have to question their motives. Are they offering genuine counsel, or are they just saying what they think you want to hear to advance their own agenda?
How do you tell the difference?
He suggested a leader needs both good systems in place, checks and balances, and sharp personal judgment, acumen, to distinguish authentic advice from self-serving flattery. You need people around you who are willing to disagree, to challenge you, grounded in the best interests of the whole enterprise, not just their own careers.
Okay, this brings everything together and back to that crucial ethical question. We pulled out all these strategic lessons: decisiveness, focus, passion, learning, adapting, networking, swift action, frankness. But can we really apply this Machiavellian toolkit in a modern company without becoming that cynical, manipulative high Mac profile we talked about? Where's the ethical line in the corporate world?
This is probably the single most important takeaway for anyone listening. The historical Machiavelli, writing for a prince who was the state, was the law in a chaotic time, absolutely does not provide justification for using cruelty, deception, or harm against others purely for personal gain within a business context today.
Why the dispute?
Because the fundamental context is different. Businesses today operate within an established framework of law, ideally maintained by a functioning government. The CEO is not the state. The rules are different. So the responsible application of Machiavelli's principles for a modern business leader isn't about seizing power through force or breaking laws. It's about, first, respecting the external rule of law, absolutely. And second, internally, it's about establishing clear, fair, and consistently enforced rules of conduct within the organization, the corporate equivalent of Machiavelli's good laws. In fact, if you're operating internationally, especially in places where the rule of law might be weaker, a truly sophisticated Machiavellian approach would argue for advocating for stronger rule of law, because stable systems are ultimately better for sustainable business, rather than exploiting the chaos. He believed good laws and good arms, meaning well-run organizations in our context, were the foundation of success.
So the real value for leaders today isn't learning how to be ruthless, but learning how to understand the dynamics of power, influence, and human nature to navigate them effectively and ethically.
Precisely. It's about sophistication, not cynicism. And this leads to two really interesting modern leadership concepts highlighted in the sources. First, paradoxical leadership.
Paradoxical, meaning holding opposites at the same time.
Exactly. Think about Machiavelli advising the prince to be both feared and loved, to be both shrewd like the fox and strong like the lion, to appear virtuous while being ready for harsh necessity. That resonates directly with modern leadership theories about paradoxical behavior. Effective leaders often do have to balance competing demands simultaneously. For example, maintaining high performance standards, creating accountability, the necessary fear, while also showing genuine compassion, empathy, and support for their team, the necessary love or referent power. It's not either, it's both hands.
That makes a lot of sense, being demanding and supportive. What was the second modern application?
Political skill. Machiavelli's incredibly detailed, often uncomfortable analysis of how power really works, the motives, the strategies, the alliances, the betrayals, provides an incredibly rich foundation for understanding political dynamics within any organization. Political skill, in the organizational behavior sense, isn't necessarily negative. It's defined as the ability to understand others accurately and use that understanding to influence them effectively towards achieving goals, hopefully shared organizational goals, but sometimes personal ones too.
So understanding Machiavelli helps you read the room, understand the power plays.
Yes. He maps out the eternal tension, for instance, between the great, those in power, maybe senior management who might want to dominate, and the people, the employees, who want autonomy and fairness, not to be oppressed. Understanding those dynamics allows a leader to navigate organizational politics much more effectively. The goal isn't necessarily to be ruthlessly Machiavellian, but to understand the game so well You can play it constructively, ethically, and achieve positive outcomes without getting blindsided or resorting to dirty tricks yourself. You understand the board so you can play better, not so you can flip the table. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has really, I think, fundamentally reshaped how we should think about that word Machiavellian. It's so much more than the simple caricature. It's loaded with history, philosophy, often just reduced to manipulator, but that misses so much. We've really unpacked three distinct layers today, haven't we? There's the historical Machiavelli, the Renaissance thinker, the consequentialist focused on stability, law, and order through tough, least bad choices. Then there's the high Mac, the modern psychological profile, that cynical, status-driven operator. And finally, the strategic manager, the leader who can take the timeless principles of decisiveness, adaptability, managing team dynamics, and apply them effectively and hopefully ethically today.
And what links them all, perhaps, the reason Machiavelli's idea still resonates so strongly after 500 years is that unflinching, almost disturbingly accurate view of human nature he presented. His observations that people can be easily swayed by appearances are often driven by self-interest and are deeply, profoundly resistant to change. Well, those psychological insights feel just as true in the 21st century as they did in the 16th.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought from Machiavelli. It's a quote that feels incredibly relevant to anyone trying to make any kind of change, lead any kind of initiative, big or small, today.
It's this observation he made. There is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to handle than to initiate a new system, or a new order of things. Why? For the reformer has enemies in all those who profit by the old system, and only lukewarm defenders in all those who would profit by the new system.
Lukewarm defenders. Why lukewarm?
He explains. This lukewarmness arising partly from the incredulity of mankind, who does not truly believe in anything new until they actually have experience of it. People just don't buy into change easily, even if it benefits them, until they see it working.
That just perfectly captures the struggle of leadership, doesn't it? Whether you're running a company, launching a project, trying to change a culture, you're always pushing against inertia and skepticism. The resistance is baked in.
So the final question we want to leave you with is this. In whatever you're currently working on, that new project, that strategic shift, that cultural change you're trying to lead, are you truly prepared for that natural, inevitable resistance from the status quo? And more importantly, have you done the hard work, the patient, persuasive work to turn those potential beneficiaries, those lukewarm defenders who are skeptical but stand to gain, into real, committed, passionate supporters, into true partisans for your cause?
Because if you haven't secured that dedicated support, Machiavelli warns, your entire effort to create that new order, however brilliant, could easily be undone by that simple, powerful force, the natural incredulity of mankind. Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We hope this gave you a richer, more strategic perspective on leadership, human nature, and the complex legacy behind one of history's most controversial names.